Hello and welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 183 review. This was a regular 2-week sprint, but we're doing the review itself a week later than normal. So we will have the Sprint 184 review next week. As usual, I will provide the overview. Kavya will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Jason on the rest. So this sprint, we kind of went back to our regular numbers, as you see, from the beginning of that big spike at 180. So we're down to 126 pull requests opened and 99 merged in the sprint, which is roughly the same as pre 180 there. And similarly, we had 39 bug fixes and 27 enhancements, along with a sprinkling of everything else. With that, I will turn it over to Kavya.
Thanks, Oleg. There are total 21 PRs that got merged across UI repos this sprint, got 10 bugs, 6 enhancements, and so on. Next one. Keypair form has a bug where add button is not getting enabled when we have only one provider in dropdown. So I fixed that issue here. Next one. Ansible repository URL SSH validation is not working. Melody added validation for that in this PR. Next one. Cloud volume edit was always getting enabled for the volumes that are not supporting as well. So I added support update notification in list view and disabled it in summary page for volumes that don't support update. Next one. In physical storage form, name populates from API response of storage manager. So we shouldn't show name field at all. AutoST team fixed that in this PR. Genealogy tree checkbox selection is not working. I fixed that issue in this PR. For cloud providers which supports showing native console, Powerpc team added a button to go to the console from provider dashboard. Next one. Gilbert converted dashboard widget to Carbon React widget in this PR. You might not see any difference between before and after screenshots, but this one has so many components and actions that are converted to React from Angular. Next one. I converted provider dashboard patternfly heat map chart to Carbon. This one is I think this one is the last provider chart that needed conversion. So it was good to see all provider charts with one framework and UI. Next one. Jeffrey converted dashboard table to Carbon React table in this PR. Next one. This is an enhancement. AutoST team raised a PR for storage resources, free space, and total size columns to display them in GB instead of bytes for better understanding. Next one. Okay, I think that's all from UI. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Kavya. So this past sprint, we added events to the supports feature mixin. There are a couple of providers which conditionally have support for event collection, depending on whether you've added either endpoints or authentications to be able to check this. So this made it simpler for us to be able to say, check supports feature when we go to start up the event catcher worker. So Kuldeep, as Kavya mentioned, moved the console URL to the base manager. So previously this feature had been in place for the physical infra provider. So he moved it up to the base manager so that cloud providers and infra managers and all others can make use of this feature. We refactored raw create key pair to return a hash. Previously, this was initially implemented by OpenStack, and OpenStack just returned the native object that's returned from the API. And this logic kind of bled into core, which was checking for features off of the returned object. This isn't really good for pluggability, so we switched it to return just a straight hash, and that way it's easier for different providers to implement this. For Amazon, we updated the list of instance types or flavors and found a couple of interesting issues out of this. The service that we were using to get the list of instance types changed how they're listing them. They no longer commit the JSON file of all of the instance types to GitHub to source control. So we had to check, move where we're checking for the list of types out of checking from GitHub and moved it to checking their hosted site. We also fixed the auth key pair create from AWS. This was different from the refactor that we did in core, but we found that the parameters that were being passed down to AWS here, we were expecting symbols, we were getting strings, and that was causing the key pair create to fail. So we fixed that up as well. As Kavya mentioned, in AutoSDE, they removed the name when creating physical storage since it isn't possible for the user to set this. It's auto-generated by the system. Next slide. For Google, we're now checking if the PubSub service, which is what we use to catch events, we're checking if it's enabled before starting the event catcher. Previously, this check was done in the loop where we go to check for events, which was causing it to essentially print an error every 15 seconds as it was trying to restart the worker. Now, before we start the worker up, we check this in order to see if it's able to be used by the event catcher. So what we're doing is we're checking it in the verify credentials method and saving the feature to the to VMDB. That way we're able to check it in MIQ server without having to do any API calls. We also fixed a bug with GCE when using a proxy. So Fog Google at some point updated how they were doing the auth API calls. They're using the Google auth gem now, and Fog Google isn't setting the proxy information for that gem. So even though all of the calls like, get a list of instances or get a list of volumes, those are all using the proxy, but the initial service credential login calls were not. And so if you were blocking all outbound traffic, the initial login was hanging. So we got a fix for that. Basically, we're just setting the proxy information for that gem specifically while we're working on a longer term fix for Fog Google. For IBM Cloud Information Center, they added a missing logo for the VMs. So the VM logo was previously missing since it was a different name than the IBM CIC EMS type. They're calling it IBM ZVM. So got a logo added for that. We also fixed the way that network managers are built after some OpenStack refactoring to try to reduce the number of methods that the child providers have to define in order for the child managers to be built correctly. Next slide. For VPC, Nasser added the ability to add the IBM Cloud Activity Tracker service key to VPC via the UI. Previously, this had only been able to be done with the Rails console in a kind of development method, but now there's the ability to add this as a separate endpoint in the params for create on the UI. He also bumped the IBM Cloud Activity Tracker gem to fix a bug where it wasn't getting required properly. For PowerVS, Kuldeep added a method to calculate the SSH key fingerprint when creating an auth key pair. This wasn't being returned by the IBM Cloud PowerVS API, and so we weren't saving it to VMDB. So now we're calculating the key fingerprint and returning it in the payload from the auth key pair create method call. Jay added a PR to raise an exception if a volume destroy fails. It was catching the exception, logging the failure, but was eating the exception as opposed to re-raising it. So it looked like it succeeded even though it didn't. So he fixed that up. He also added affinity selection when provisioning a new volume in the provisioning dialogues. The affinity that you're selecting limits other fields that you're able to pick. And so adding that drop down just ensures that you're not able to pick an invalid configuration when adding a new volume. The PowerVS team also fixed the Cloud Object Store authentication check. They have an additional authentication record that they're using for their image import workflow, and it was not being checked as part of the authentication check. We were only checking the default authentication. They also added the ability to save the volume type name during inventory refresh, so it's a little bit more user-friendly to see what the type of the volume is. The built-in name was not necessarily that helpful but the description was of the volume type. And then Kuldeep also added the backend support for the native console URL for PowerVS. Next slide. For HMC this sprint, they're raising an exception if an HTTP error is hit during refresh. This is kind of a similar issue to the volume delete where they were logging the exception, but they weren't re-raising the error. So it looked like it was successful. So it's no longer an issue. They also improved the error message if verify credentials fails. Previously, it was returning an XML payload, and that wasn't too helpful for users when they saw that on UI. So now we're pulling the user-friendly error out of the XML. They're also setting the host VMM vendor attribute so that they can display the proper icon for hosts in PowerHMC. For PowerVC, continuing the native console trend, Kuldeep added native console support for PowerVC. This is using the endpoint that you have configured for the provider to bring you to the proper location, where for IBM Cloud, it's pretty easy because it's always IBM Cloud. They also fixed a bug in reports where they were incorrectly using advanced setting names. So the reports were coming back as empty. So they got that fixed up. We also updated the definition for the network manager and Cinder manager associations to match the OpenStack refactoring. Next slide. And for Oracle Cloud, we found that it was using an insane amount of memory when it loaded the gem. So the provider region validation was essentially loading like tens or hundreds of megabytes of memory when it loaded the gem. So we switched that to use a proc so that it gets delay loaded and only when it actually has to use the validation. In addition to that, we also only require the specific regions definitions. This drastically cuts down memory usage to a few K as opposed to a few hundred meg. And for VMware, we use the Vim log to be able to set the RBVMO MyLogger so that if you have debug enabled, you can see the SOAP traffic if you're looking to debug any communications issues between the provider and the VC. Finally, I think that's it. Over to Jason.
Thanks, Adam. Lots of changes over there. On the platform side, Kuldeep added the console URL for physical infra and cloud providers. We saw the screenshot earlier about the native console, and this is the core platform change for that. I bumped the worker count of the UI and API to 2. They were originally at 1, but those numbers don't really work very well especially in podified environments where you're behind a load balance service. If the worker goes down, there's nothing to load balance to. So it makes more sense to have 2. And from our experience, most users pick a number at least 2 and usually higher than that. Adam added a message timeout option to the job queue signal. There was before this, there was no way to set an alternative message timeout. And so this sets it up so that the provider authors can use that. As Adam said, support events was added to EXT management system as a base. And this allows us to check whether or not events are even able to be collected at all before we start workers and for some other usages. Brandon made a change to the operator to upgrade the indirect dependencies. These were mostly security fixes with old versions. And that's part of his work as he's starting to upgrade from the old 0.18 operator SDK to the latest 1.18. He also added HTTP GET health probes using the ping endpoint. Previously, we would just check if the socket was available, but that's not good enough to know if the actual app is healthy or not. Whereas executing the /ping endpoint will actually run through the Rails stack and make sure that we're not frozen or hung up or anything like that. So those changes went in. And finally, I got rid of some technical debt. The log decorator gem was only used by Amazon SSA support, and it didn't really need it. So we dropped that gem and got it out of our application. Brandon fixed a bug on the operator side. He added a permission to edit the routes. When we go create the external route, the permissions that were defined weren't broad enough, and there could be failures when trying to create that route. Adam added a fix to the UI worker where there was a race condition where singletons as they're loading the code would conflict and cause a lockup. This kind of goes along with the HTTP GET health probes because there was a lockup and we didn't know it. So this preloads all the UI classes before we spawn off the various threads, which prevents the problem from happening. There'll be some future work to get rid of those singletons and make that a little bit more flexible in the future. And finally, I added a spec that checks with the tool called message format on each PO file, which are the translation files. We found that some of the translations that we received from our translation team had problems in them, and the specs were added to catch those problems ahead of time before they make their way into a merged PR. Next slide, please. We have no changes on the API side. There was a small bug fixed by Keenan, but on the developer side, I added a few more repos to switch to GitHub Actions, namely Log Decorator and ManageIQ Loggers. And I'll be continuing with more of that in the coming sprints. And that's all.
Very good. So as I mentioned, the next sprint review is next week. Hopefully the link there is right. And with that, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the community, the speakers here, and all the contributors to all the code here in ManageIQ. See you next time. Thank you so much.